4 carriers gone in 6 minutes, not 6 hours. Not 6 days, 6 minutes. And the Japanese Navy that had ruled the Pacific for 6 months was finished. By the time the smoke cleared on the afternoon of June 4th, 1942, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 300 trained airmen, and any realistic hope of winning the war they'd started at Pearl Harbor. The history books call it America's greatest naval miracle. The codebreakers who cracked Japanese communications. The dive bombers that arrived at exactly the right moment. The triumph of intelligence over strength. But here's what that story buries. America didn't win Midway. Japan destroyed itself on a map that didn't exist, with intelligence that had already collapsed before the first plane left the deck, and a rearming order given at the worst possible moment based on a picture of the battlefield that was entirely, fatally wrong. If you were alive in June 1942, you read the headlines. America wins Midway, Pacific turning point, miracle at sea. What nobody told you, what every documentary and textbook since has glossed over, was that Japan's plan had already broken apart hours before the American dive bombers ever found their targets. A submarine screen failed, a catapult jammed, and a single intelligence gap handed Admiral Nagumo a false map of a battlefield with no American carriers on it. The decision he made from that false map, at 7:15 in the morning of June 4th, is one of the most consequential blunders in the history of naval warfare. This is how Japan handed America the Pacific War before the battle was 40 minutes old. If you want to understand why every major turning point in history had a single decision that made it inevitable, subscribe. I break one down every week. Hit subscribe now before we go deep on this. That false map, the one Nagumo would bet 4 carriers on, didn't appear by accident. It was built piece by piece, weeks before the battle started, by a chain of failures that no one caught in time. Japan's battle plan for Midway was engineered around certainty. Certainty that the American carriers were still in the South Pacific, licking their wounds from Coral Sea. Certainty that Midway's defenders were isolated. Certainty that Japan would have time. Time to bomb the island into submission. Time to land troops. Time to draw the Americans into a prepared trap if they came at all. That certainty rested on a single foundation. The submarine Cordon Admiral Yamamoto had positioned 19 submarines in 2 patrol lines west of Hawaii, stretching hundreds of miles across the Pacific. Their job was simple. When the American fleet sailed out, if it sailed out, those submarines would see it. They would report it, and Nagumo's carriers, already running toward Midway, would know what was coming. Most accounts of Midway skip past this entirely. They don't tell you that the entire intelligence architecture of Japan's plan depended on those submarines being in position before the Americans left Pearl Harbor. They weren't. The submarines arrived late. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, had already sailed through the patrol lines before the Japanese submarines reached their stations. The net had been cast after the fish had already passed through. So why did Nagumo proceed as though the net had caught something? Curiosity, because no one told him it hadn't. The submarines reported nothing. And in Japanese operational logic, no contact meant no carriers. Not that the carriers had slipped through unseen, but the submarine failure was only the first crack in Nagumo's picture of the battlefield. What was about to happen on the flight deck of the heavy cruiser? Tone would make everything worse, and it would happen because of a catapult. That distinction between absence of contact and contact reporting absence would cost Japan the Pacific War. Nagumo was flying blind. Before the battle started, and he didn't know it, the submarines were silent. The carriers were undetected. And aboard the cruiser Tone, a catapult was about to jam at the worst possible moment, setting in motion a chain of events that would determine the fate of 4 carriers. That jammed catapult, 30 seconds of mechanical failure, would cascade into 30 minutes of lost time. And those 30 minutes would make Nagumo's rearming decision irreversible. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, Admiral Nagumo launched his first wave, 108 aircraft aimed at Midway Atoll. Simultaneously, he launched search planes, float planes catapulted from the heavy cruisers ringing the carrier force, to scan the ocean for any American ships lurking nearby. 7 search planes, 7 sectors of ocean. Standard procedure. The searches were supposed to push out in parallel fans, giving Nagumo an early picture of the battlefield. 6 of the 7 planes launched on time. The 7th, assigned to Sector 4, the sector covering the exact patch of ocean where the American carriers were waiting, launched 30 minutes late. Not because of weather, not because of enemy action, because the heavy cruiser Tone had a catapult malfunction. A maintenance failure that no one had caught in weeks of preparation. This is the part that gets stripped out of virtually every account that focuses on American heroism. The timing wasn't coincidence. The catapult failure didn't just delay the intelligence, it delayed it precisely long enough to catch Nagumo in the middle of the one operation that made changing course nearly impossible. Here's the geometry. The American carriers, Task Force 16 and 17 under Admirals Spruance and Fletcher, were positioned northeast of Midway, waiting. They knew Nagumo was coming because American codebreakers had pieced together enough of the Japanese operational code to know the target, the date, and the rough approach. When the first Japanese wave hit Midway, Spruance launched his aircraft immediately. He didn't wait for perfect intelligence. He launched on the window he had. So why didn't Nagumo do the same? Simply wait for all 7 search reports before committing his reserve aircraft. The Tone search plane finally spotted the American force at 7:28 a.m., but its initial report was incomplete. 10 ships, no carrier identification. A corrected report identifying carriers didn't arrive until after 8 a.m. By then, Nagumo had already made his decision. The catapult failure hadn't just produced bad intelligence. It had produced the worst possible intelligence at the worst possible moment, arriving just late enough to find Nagumo already committed. The search plane was in the air, late, flying toward the Americans, not yet seeing them, and back on the carriers, Nagumo was about to make the decision that would define the battle. Not because he was reckless, because the map he was working from told him it was safe. That false picture, no American carriers, no immediate threat, was exactly what Nagumo saw when he made the most consequential single order of the Pacific War. By 7 a.m., reports were coming back from the first wave over Midway. The island had been hit. Damage had been done. But the strike commander radioed back that a second strike was needed. Midway's airfields were still operational, its defenses still functional. If Japan intended to land troops, the island had to be hit again. Nagumo had a decision to make. His first wave was returning and would need to land. His reserve aircraft, held back for any threat from American surface forces, were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Weapons for warships. If he was going to use them against Midway instead, they needed to be rearmed with land attack bombs. He checked his intelligence picture. The submarine Cordon had reported nothing. 6 of his 7 search planes had reported nothing. The one sector that hadn't fully reported yet was Sector 4, the Tone's late plane still flying outbound. No American carriers. No immediate naval threat. A clear need to hit Midway again. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo gave the order. Rearm the reserve aircraft, switch from torpedoes to land bombs, prepare for a second strike on Midway. Most accounts treat this as the moment Nagumo's caution turned fatal. But that framing misses something. At 7:14, this was not a reckless decision. It was the logical response to the intelligence picture he had, a picture that had already been poisoned before the battle started. The rearming began immediately. Torpedoes were unloaded. Bombs were hauled up from the magazines. Dozens of aircraft on the hangar decks were being reconfigured simultaneously. At 7:28 a.m., 13 minutes after the rearming order, the Tone search plane finally spotted the American force. 13 minutes. That's all the margin there was between a manageable tactical problem and an unrecoverable catastrophe. What those 13 minutes of rearming meant in physical terms is what explains why Nagumo couldn't simply reverse the order. Nagumo was not making a blunder at 7:15. He was making the only logical move available from the position he was in, a position that had been losing for weeks. Before he sat down to play it, the order was given. The rearming was underway, and somewhere northeast of the carrier fleet, the Tone search plane was finally transmitting the intelligence that should have arrived an hour earlier. the intelligence that would tell Nagumo his board had just been turned upside down. That transmission, the one identifying American carriers to the northeast, arrived on a flight deck already in organized chaos, with rearming in progress and no clean way back. Reversing a rearming order mid-process is not like canceling a command. Torpedoes had been removed from aircraft and were sitting on hangar decks and elevator platforms. Bombs were being loaded in their place. Aircraft were partially disassembled for the switch. The flight decks above were occupied with the returning first wave, aircraft that needed to land, be refueled, and be rearmed before they could fly again. Nagumo's options, and which had seemed clear at 7:14, now had no good answer. He could launch the reserve aircraft immediately, armed with the land bombs now being loaded against warships, but land bombs against carriers are dramatically less effective than torpedoes. He could halt the rearming, wait for the hangar decks to clear, switch back to torpedoes, and launch later. But that meant launching without fighter escort, since his Zeros were already committed to defending the fleet from Midway-based aircraft. Or he could wait, complete the landing of the first wave, rearm everything properly and launch a coordinated strike, which meant another 90 minutes of vulnerability. He chose to wait. To do it properly. Here's what the standard heroic American narrative of Midway never asks. What would a Japanese admiral with correct intelligence have done differently? The answer reveals that Midway wasn't a battle Japan lost through bad command. It was a battle Japan was never set up to win on the intelligence picture they were operating with. If Nagumo had known American carriers were present northeast of his position at 6:30 a.m. before he ever launched the Midway strike, what was his correct move? And why was the Japanese system structured so that he couldn't know? Nagumo's choice to wait was arguably the tactically rational decision given what he knew. True, but while he waited, the flight decks were crowded with refueling aircraft, armed bombs stacked in hangars, and unsecured ordnance everywhere. The American dive bombers didn't need to do anything sophisticated. They just needed to arrive. The real error wasn't made at 7:15 or at 8 or during the agonizing 90 minutes that followed. It was made weeks earlier, when the intelligence architecture Nagumo depended on was already broken and no one in the Japanese chain of command knew it. Those dive bombers, the ones Nagumo had no warning of, the ones his fighter screen was out of position to intercept, arrived at 10:22 a.m., when the Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable moment in the entire battle. 3 carriers. 6 minutes, Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit first. A single bomb penetrated to the upper hangar deck, where aircraft were being refueled and rearmed. The explosion triggered the ordnance. The ordnance triggered the fuel. Within minutes, the carrier was a cascading series of secondary explosions. Kaga took 4 direct hits in rapid succession. Her hangar decks, similarly stacked with ordnance from the incomplete rearming, produced the same catastrophic chain reaction. She burned for hours before sinking. Soryu took 3 hits and was abandoned within 20 minutes. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, survived the first attack, separated from the others during the assault. Her aircraft managed to strike Yorktown twice, but American dive bombers found Hiryu that afternoon and put 4 bombs into her. She sank the following morning. In a single afternoon, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of the strike force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, ranged across the Indian Ocean, and ruled the Pacific for 6 months. 300 trained airmen were dead. But here's what the casualty numbers don't capture. What Japan actually lost at Midway wasn't just the ships. It was the operational window. American accounts focus on the carriers sunk. Neither they nor Japanese post-battle analysis fully reckons with the structural truth underneath. The battle was decided not by what happened on June 4th, but by the decision architecture that made June 4th inevitable. Japan would eventually build replacement carriers and train new pilots. So why did Midway prove to be the genuine turning point, after which Japanese victory became impossible, rather than simply a costly setback? Japan's carrier pilot training program could not produce replacements at anything approaching the necessary rate. American industrial production could replace ships. Japan could not replace the trained airmen at the rate they were being lost. Midway accelerated that attrition past the point of recovery. The battle didn't just sink carriers, it broke Japan's ability to project carrier air power at scale for the rest of the war. 4 carriers sunk. 300 airmen dead. The Pacific turned in an afternoon. But the real question, the one Yamamoto himself spent the rest of the war wrestling with, wasn't who won Midway. It was why Japan's intelligence system had produced a picture of the battlefield so disconnected from reality that defeat was nearly inevitable before the first plane took off. That question, why Japan's intelligence picture was so wrong, and why no one in the chain of command caught it, takes you back past the catapult, past the submarines, to the deeper structural failure that made all of it possible. Japan's operational security before Midway was, by any reasonable measure, excellent. The Americans couldn't read the full Japanese operational order. Codebreakers had pieced together enough fragments to make Nimitz confident enough to act, but Japan kept the operation compartmentalized, moved quickly, and left American intelligence scrambling to confirm what it suspected. The problem wasn't that Japan failed to keep their plan secret. The problem was that Japan's intelligence system was built to confirm intentions, not to discover facts. The submarine Cordon was designed to detect the American fleet if it moved. It wasn't designed to handle the possibility that the American fleet might move before the Cordon was in place. When the submarines arrived late and found nothing, the system reported that as confirmation of what Japan expected, not as a gap in coverage that needed to be flagged. The search plane protocol was designed to extend Nagumo's vision. But when Sector 4 reported nothing in its abbreviated coverage, because the plane hadn't yet reached the American formation, that silence was read as confirmation rather than incomplete data. This is the strategic lesson that gets stripped out of almost every Midway account because it's less dramatic than dive bombers and more uncomfortable than heroism. How many other battles, campaigns, and strategic decisions in history were made on maps that looked complete but were actually just mirrors of expectation? Nagumo wasn't operating from bad intelligence. He was operating from a system structurally incapable of telling him what it didn't know. Every gap in knowledge was being silently converted into confirmation of the expected picture. The map that Nagumo trusted on the morning of June 4th wasn't a description of reality. It was a description of what Japan expected reality to be, and the two had diverged fatally. The most dangerous intelligence failure isn't false information. It's a system that can't distinguish between what it knows and what it assumes. Yamamoto's plan accounted for American carrier strength, American base defenses, American resupply routes. What it didn't account for was the possibility that his own intelligence architecture would fail to function as designed, and that those failures would be invisible until it was too late to correct them. That catastrophic gap between the expected picture and reality is what every post-Midway analysis eventually circles back to. But most assign it to Nagumo personally, which gets the lesson exactly backwards. The conventional verdict on Nagumo is harsh, indecisive, too cautious. Should have launched immediately when the Tone's report came in, even with half-armed aircraft, rather than waiting for a perfect strike. That verdict isn't wrong exactly, but it assigns personal blame to a systemic failure, which is the most common mistake in post-battle analysis. Nagumo's 715 rearming order wasn't a blunder in the sense of ignoring available intelligence. It was the logical response to the intelligence picture he had. The blunder was made by everyone, by the planners who designed an architecture that couldn't flag its own gaps, by the maintenance crews who didn't catch the catapult fault, by the submarine command that didn't recognize the critical deployment window, by an operational culture that treated silence as confirmation rather than uncertainty. 1 admiral, 4 carriers. 6 months of Pacific dominance evaporated in an afternoon, but the chess player who lost wasn't the one sitting at the board on June 4th. The position had been losing for weeks before the game started, built on an assessment of American carrier locations that was outdated before it was written, defended by a submarine screen that arrived after the pieces had moved, dependent on search intelligence that the Tone's catapult had already compromised before the first move was made. When American dive bombers appeared over the Japanese carrier force at 10:22 a.m., What decision could Nagumo have made that would have changed the outcome, given the intelligence picture he actually had? The answer is almost nothing. His options had already been narrowed before the battle began. The decisions that mattered had been made by systems and structures and accumulated assumptions, not by any single man looking at a board. Japan didn't lose the Pacific War on the morning of June 4th, 1942. Japan lost it on the day they built an intelligence picture. They couldn't question and sailed 4 carriers toward a battlefield. They had already, unknowingly, surrendered. That's the real lesson of Midway. Not that Japan's plan was reckless. Not that America's code breakers were brilliant, though they were. The lesson is that the most dangerous moment in any campaign isn't when you face your opponent's best move. It's when you're playing an entirely different game than the one actually in progress, and your intelligence system is too broken to tell you.